So thank you to you all for being here for our second webinar in the series of Youth Work Insights, focusing specifically on gender and misogyny. And today we're really lucky because we're going to be hearing from all sorts of different people about work specifically with young women, or the impacts of gender and misogyny on young women. So we've asked our panelists to think about the work that they do and their research and their experience related to this particular topic. We've been thinking about how gender stereotypes are really, really rooted in society in every different aspect of them, and how these stereotypes really shape how young men and young women are expected to behave. These stereotypes are quite limiting. They affect young people's life opportunities and chances, and often can lead to people experiencing discrimination. What we know, particularly with young women, is that language is often used to demean them. It can create an environment where there's harmful attitudes and harmful behaviours that they experience, like sexual harassment. And we've got somebody with us from the Girl Guides that can talk about their research a bit later. Online abuse, systematic violence, and that those things thrive both online and offline. What we know is that currently young people are operating increasingly in a digital world, and that those spaces are really, really hard to regulate, and they're increasing some of the prejudice and discrimination and harm that's being perpetrated to young women and experienced by young women and young men. And that sometimes there's a really interesting connection between those online behaviours, those online actions and real world behaviours. And so what we're hoping to do today is to create a space for you to hear from some real experts in the field that are really knowledgeable about some of these topics, so that you can learn from them and take from them some of their research and experience that you can then take into your practice with young people. Just to let you know, we have got my colleagues Karen and Zaina in the background who are going to be monitoring the chat and any questions that you have, and we'll filter those through, and at the end of this session we'll have some time to take and respond to some of those questions. So anything that you've got, pop in the chat, and we can go from there. So without further ado, I'm going to start introducing some of our panelists. They're incredible. You can see them all on the screen. So I'm not going to steal their thunder by telling you too much about them, because they're going to do a much better job at that themselves. So I'm going to go to each person in turn and give them a few moments just to tell you a bit about themselves and a bit about their work and what their specific area and interest and expertise is around this topic. So I'm going to start with Chloe, if that's okay. Over to you, Chloe.
Thanks so much, Abby. Hello, everyone. My name is Chloe G. I'm Head of Strategy at Girl Guiding UK. It's a charity that works with around 300,000 girls each year through volunteers at the community level, but we also do things nationally out of our headquarters based in London, and we're a trans-inclusive all-girls space. You might have heard about Girl Guiding or not, so just to kind of give you a simple roundup of what we do, we run a programme which enables girls to explore skills and interests in a non-academic setting. And that can range, I'll just throw some stuff out there, upcycling, learning to speak out on a topic, archaeology, adventure, campaigning, cooking, digital design. That's just the kind of things that girls do. And in my role at Girl Guiding, I lead lots of different strategic initiatives and the planning of the charity, and lots of research with girls and impact evaluation with girls and volunteers. So understanding how our programme leads to, key outcomes for girls. And other data and insight, that's kind of my bag. I also do work on ED&I and sustainability. So hoping to bring sort of insights today from the research we've done with girls. As we are a girl-led organisation, we're led by them, we're led by what they want us to look at and what they want us to do. Previous to Girl Guiding, I worked as a senior strategist at Plan International, another organisation focused on girls and young women, and done lots of volunteering in sort of smaller local charities with girls, and do some further study in my sort of spare time on gender, sexuality and society. So that's a little bit from me. Thanks for having me.
Thanks,
today.
Chloe. What a range of experience we're going to get to draw on. That's fantastic. And a side note, I was on a panel with one of your young women a few years ago who now works on a gender advisory panel for the Scottish government, Amanda. So some really brilliant outcomes for young women that have worked with you. So fantastic. Thank you. Caroline, can I come to you next, please?
You can. Thank you, Abby. And hello, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this event. I'm a senior program manager at London's Violence Reduction Unit. For those of you who aren't familiar with the London VRU, we were established by the Mayor in 2019 to lead a new approach to violence affecting young people in the capital. An approach that is focused on prevention and early intervention. And just put very simply, we believe that violence is preventable if you support, if you nurture, and if you invest in young people and in positive opportunities for young people. So in the past 5 years, we have delivered 350,000 positive opportunities and targeted interventions for young Londoners. So I lead on our work around girls and young women, who I feel are often very absent from that narrative about violence affecting young people. Yet we know that violence affects girls differently and in many ways disproportionately. So I'm really interested today in ensuring that girls sort of aren't forgotten about and are afforded opportunities too in order to thrive and reach their potential. But I'm so interested in prevention, and I'm interested in partnerships and sort of the roles of different agencies such as youth work in addressing some of these underlying factors that are really sort of driving violence affecting women and girls. And I do really believe that we all have a role to play in that. My background is in local government and central government, so in sort of public policy. And in my own time, I also do a lot of volunteering with organisations such as the Charity Refuge. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Some really interesting stuff to come out there. I'm also really interested in the absence of young women's experiences in exploitation particularly, so I'll definitely be looking forward to hearing a bit more about that later. Thanks. Christina, can we come to you, please?
Yes, hello everybody. Really nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm an academic. My job title is a reader, which is something like an associate professor. I'm based at King's College London, which means that in my daily life I do teaching, currently way too much marking, but I also do research. And I have a background in sociology and gender studies. I did my doctorate in gender studies. And I've always had an interest specifically in exploring the experiences of young women, as it were, of diverse groups of young women who have different class backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, and how they make sense of the world around them, specifically in relation to inequalities, be that gendered inequalities or racial inequalities or class inequalities. So that's been the kind of thread through my work. I'm not going to bore you with all the different research projects I've been involved in. If that becomes relevant, I'll provide some more context and background. But yes, my interest is in how unequal power relationships are experienced and made sense of by us all, and why awareness doesn't always help protect us from the impacts that these power relationships have on us, with a particular interest in young women and girls. And I guess that's why I'm here today. Thank you.
It certainly is. Thank you. Particularly interested in what you were talking about class and intersectionality there. Also, I did hear, I think Chloe was saying she's studying as well, and I'm also a gender studies student elsewhere, so we'll definitely be picking your brain. And I know Chantal's doing a PhD, so yeah, I'm sure there'll be lots and lots for lots of us to take from your input today. Thank you. Jake, can we come to you next, please?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for giving your time and for allowing me to talk about the work of Tender. My name's Jake Saunders. I'm the head of school and youth setting programmes at Tender. We're a national domestic abuse prevention charity, and we work predominantly with children and young people in schools and out of school settings as well, talking about healthy relationships, That starts in primary school, students talking about friendships and other relationships in their lives. And then as we get older, talking more explicitly about domestic abuse, how it impacts young people in their lives, with the hopes of shifting their knowledge, but also giving them the skills and sort of the ability to identify when things aren't going right in their relationships. We're a national charity. We work across London and the South East. We have a base in Norwich, we have a base in Bath and North East Somerset, and we're also working up in West Yorkshire. So we're trying to reach as many young people as we can, wherever they are. Many young people, that is, in schools, but of course there is a humongous amount of young people that we need to reach in out of school settings. So we're doing a lot of work to grow that area of work and make sure that the voices of young women and girls are heard by us as an organisation, and that those their experiences are influencing the work that we're delivering across the country. I started off with Tender as a member of their youth board, so as a young activist wanting to get involved with preventing domestic abuse and gender-based violence. I then went on to deliver the work, which has just given me an incredible on-the-ground experience of hearing the experiences of girls and young women in these youth settings. And now I take more of a strategic lead in growing and directing our work across the country. We take a gendered lens to the issue, so it's really, really important to us that when we're working with young people, we're not ignoring the facts that gender-based violence is a gendered issue. There is disproportionate impact on girls and young women, and it's really important that we don't hide that. Yes, of course, boys and young men are impacted, but it's really important that the voices of the disproportionately affected communities are at the heart of the messaging that we're delivering. So yeah, really excited to talk about some of the work that we're doing, some of the experiences and the voices that we're hearing in the settings that we work with. So yeah, thanks for having me again.
Thanks, Jake. Really timely, given that there's been lots of conversations in the press in the past week about relationships education and some of the concerns and challenges coming there. So we'll hope that you don't get too many questions fielded your way about those things, but undoubtedly it will come up. Thank you. Last but not least, I'm going to go to you, Chantal, if that's okay, for an intro.
Of course. Hi, everybody. My name's Chantal Lunt, and I am a Black civil rights activist. I founded Ms BLM Alliance, and I also chair an organisation called Ms Alliance for Racial Equality, which is a CIC. So a lot of the work that we wanted to do when we set up these organisations is really bring that intersectional lens to Black civil rights activism, exploring uncomfortable topics that have kind of really come to light at the moment. If anyone's seen the P. Diddy video of how, you know, gender violence can impact Black women, and also why it might be more difficult for Black women in particular and Black young girls to engage with the police because of that really strange relationship with the police, and, you know, what coming forward about domestic abuse can do in terms of the response of Black men and boys. So that's something we've explored before through panels and learning sessions. We also deliver lectures and trainings and learning days that explore misogyny, which is something I'll speak about a little bit later, which is obviously the intersection of misogyny and Blackness toward Black women. And we don't just, you know, talk about the gritty subjects. We also really celebrate Black women. So we've done a number of events that celebrate Black women in the arts, that celebrate Black women in the community, that celebrate Black women heroes and Black women throughout history. Because while men within Black communities are absolutely incredible, quite often the stories of Black women and girls who've shaped history and who have actually shaped the civil rights movement, which is where Black women and girls are massively prevalent, they're lesser known. So when we do community and school and, you know, all of those learning sessions that we do out and about, we always include and encourage children, young people, right up through to adults to learn about those things and to understand that the Black civil rights movement is massively held up by Black women and girls. We are massively inclusive of every spectrum across the board, so gender, LGBTQ, especially trans women, and we massively know what the contributions of trans Black women to sister movements such as LGBTQ plus movements and other movements has been, and we celebrate them unapologetically so. On a personal level, I'm still in my office, so I should probably mention that that's not my only role. I am a PhD researcher and I'm also a lecturer. I teach in the School of Education in LJMU, and I'm also the first Black woman to be elected as a councillor for Knowsley Metropolitan Borough Council, and I serve St Gabriel's ward. I think that's my whole Insta bio. I won't keep you much longer with introductions.
Thanks, Chantal. And of course, we will be sharing people's professional bios and information afterwards. So if people want to dig into some of those particular parts that you talked about, they can there. I think there'll be a lot of people interested, particularly in what you're talking about celebrating culture and really celebrating the role of Black women in the civil rights movement and how that can really help shape positive experiences for young women in youth and community work. So I fully expect people to be drilling down into that with you today. So as I said, everybody, what a panel, right? We've got such a breadth of experience and knowledge that I really hope we're going to have the opportunity for some interesting debate and discussion and dialogue that's going to help you in your work with young people and communities after today. Quick reminder, flow any questions through, we'll pick them up at the end, and we'll just take the conversation through, but we'll make sure that we take time for some questions towards the end. So we're going to start by focusing on macro. So we're going to be thinking about, what is this? What are the experiences of young women? What are the things that we're talking about with misogyny and misogyny in relation to sort of communities and society and culture more broadly? I think I'm going to start with coming to you, Christina, because I think it would be really useful for us to start with some definitions. I think we assume that everybody knows what we're talking about and that we all use the same language for things, and I'm not always sure that that's right and accurate. So can we come to you to think about what do we mean when we're talking about misogyny and feminism, and if there's any other useful key terms you think might be helpful for us today?
Thank you. Yeah, really good question. Let's start with feminism in the first instance. I think there'll probably be as many different understandings of feminism on this panel as there are panelists. It's a very contested concept, term, experience. Feminists of all stripes, I would say, tend to be very invested in their particular understanding of what feminism should be and who it should represent, and that can lead to a lot of conflict. Historically, there's always been a good level of debate amongst feminists, to put it politely. But I think what's important as one point is that I describe it as a political movement that advocates for equality amongst all genders. So mainly ensuring that hierarchies of power, where historically and in fact still men often occupy positions of power where this is questioned. Feminism for a long time, although these attempts have often been silenced, but for a long time feminism has advocated for an understanding that not all women's or all men's experiences are the same, but that they are in fact very much impacted by our positionings in relation to race and class and sexuality and so on. So that's a really important point. And I say that that's not just a recent development, because I think sometimes, with the advent of social media, it seems to appear that intersectionality was only something that feminists started thinking about in 1989. I can define that term for those who want to, but also maybe this is something Chantal wants to talk about because she already mentioned misogynoir, Chantal. But the idea that, not all women's experiences are the same, and that some women are privileged, for example, on the basis of being white or middle class or heterosexual, that idea has been around for a very long time. And I think that's important to understand. Misogyny, let's stick to a very simple definition of Google, you would say. Disdain towards women, dislike and disdain towards women. And of course, the ways, again, it can affect particular women in specific ways. Misogyny is a really important context in this, a really important term in this context. Yeah, and other things we ought to be aware of. Can I mention one term, and then I feel I've spoke for long enough? Let's talk about individualism. We like to think of ourselves very much as individuals, that makes sense with the ways in which our society is structured. However, our experiences are often affected by exactly our gender, racial background, class background. And maybe we will come back to this in our discussion, but I think we need to be aware of differences between, structures and individuals and how the two interrelate, and how, as much as we like to think of ourselves as individuals, our experiences are very much affected by our positioning in society.
Thanks, Christina. That was brilliant, really helpful. I think the key things that really stood out there was about the fact that there's lots and lots of different understandings of terminology, and that actually the most important thing is the recognition that everybody's experiences might be slightly different within the same particular grouping. So, for example, we talk about young women, and there might be some universal experience of being young women, but that actually what you're saying is that importantly within that is the recognition that our own experiences are shaped by who we are, where we are, what our experiences are, our culture, our community, our class, our race, our socioeconomic background, and that we need to perhaps, as workers, think about how those different things might relate to each other when we're seeking to work and support young people in those spaces. So thank you. You did signpost me really nicely to Chantal, actually. Chantal, you've already mentioned that you're going to be talking about misogyny and also colorism. Would be really helpful if you could give us a bit of insight on what these mean, what these words mean, and what's their relation to sort of identity development for young women.
Yeah, I'd say there's a few terms, I know it won't be too long, but that directly relate to the whole journey, especially in the third and fourth wave of feminism, in understanding that, feminism, as has been said, is not a one-size-fits-all. And obviously Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 coined the term intersectionality, which kind of blew up in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter wave of the Black civil rights movement. And essentially it speaks to compound discrimination, compound advantage or compound disadvantage, and it's understanding that we're not just people. Sometimes will just see you as Black and that's your whole identity, but we understand that people are made up of many identities. So you might be a Black queer woman, you might have a disability, and if they are things that are seen as disadvantages socially, then they compound, and they can sometimes mean that you have an experience that is more difficult than that to maybe a white middle-class woman who is able-bodied and cisgender, for example. So it's understanding that just because we all join together under the banner of womanhood, it doesn't mean that we're all having the same experiences, and understanding those different experiences of marginalization or advantage are key to understanding how sometimes, although you might be a woman, you can't step into specific doors or specific spaces because of your gender or because of your race or level of ability. And then obviously misogyny is one that has become more popular, and that's by Moira Bailey, and that was 2008 that one came to prominence, which just speaks to that intersection of gender and race. Again, that term kind of blew up in terms of prominence around Child Q, who was a child in Hackney, who was treated horrifically when she went to sit at GCSEs. And some would say the school colluded with the police to strip search this child without the presence of a parent and then send her back into a GCSEs. And obviously she was traumatized by that experience. But what that kind of did in civil rights spaces was it created a space to discuss that unique discrimination that Black girls and Black young women face. Because so much of our movement focuses on what happens to Black young men, and rightly so, because of the level of violence, but there's a different level of, whether it be psychological violence or not being safe in safe spaces that Black women and girls experience. And Beba Henry and Nicole Smallman were another example of that. When they were murdered, the bodies weren't searched for, and then the police took selfies with them, and that speaks to the level of disregard that Black women's bodies are held. Colorism is one that I would say is really specifically relevant to young Black girls, because colorism essentially speaks to proximity to whiteness and proximity to Western beauty standards. So within Black communities, there is a whole spectrum of shades and colours, you know, right down to very, very light skinned with almost Western hair, right up to dark skinned with 40, very tightly curly hair. And every part of that spectrum is absolutely beautiful. But society often places this part of the spectrum, the part that aligns with whiteness, the part that, you know, aligns with Western beauty standards, smaller nose, lighter skin, straighter hair. And that's a beauty standard that is impossible for many Black young girls to reach. And it can do Black young girls a lot of harm trying to reach that standard. It can cause something called internalized racism, where people internalize these notions of beauty and this notions that, you know, there's something wrong with themselves, and can try to conform with them through, you know, it's everyone's choice how they present themselves, but that choice should be rooted in how you want to present yourself rather than how you feel you should. If we look at workplaces, quite often for years, like, many Black women would not wear the hair the way I'm wearing mine. Even now, if you Google inappropriate workplace hairstyles, it will come up with afros, and almost every picture will be Black hairstyles, and that is internalized. But what that creates is a discrimination within discrimination, whereas if you are darker skinned and you have tighter hair, then you might experience discrimination in a different way. And one of the biggest indicators of how this manifests, and it's not just within the UK, it's the whole diaspora, the whole African diaspora is one of a huge epidemic in the African continent at the moment, is use of very harmful bleaching products, where people are actually bleaching the skin to be lighter skinned, and this is the legacy of colonialism and caste systems and all of those things that have constantly reinforced that the closer you are to whiteness, the more socially advantaged you'll be. So there's loads of reasons behind this. And this is where Instagram can actually be sometimes a powerful affirming tool. There is a lot of resistance to that within communities. There are a lot of Black girls and women unashamedly embracing their natural beauty, their natural hair, their curls, their kinks, all of those things. And there are pages and platforms dedicated to just loving dark-skinned Black girls, as there should be. But to say that it isn't still a really prevalent problem would you know, it wouldn't be true, because it is. I saw a video just today of people campaigning in Nigeria against bleaching products because they can cause cancer and they are very, very harmful. And then the final term, which I just think is so relevant to this discussion, especially in the context of young Black girls, is weathering, which was a term that was coined in the early 90s by Professor Arlene I'm going to try and pronounce her surname, Jeremenius. That would be my pronunciation, but please feel free to correct me. And she was an incredible, well, she still is an incredible woman who at the time understood that there was a physiological manifestation of racism within Black women, and essentially weathering is that internalization process and how it harms Black women. It's one of the things thought to contribute to the statistics that make Black women 4 times more likely to die in childbirth and bring about a lot of complications. She was labelled the biggest threat to youth in the US when she coined this term, because what she actually found was Black women were safer to have children at a younger age. This was interpreted as her promoting teen pregnancy, and she was almost blacklisted for this. But what she was saying is something that a lot of us, and this will be my final point for now, know within the Black community. Like, I had my son age 19. At that age, my mum had died when I was 14, and my foster mum, who wasn't much older, was very, very ill. And I'd seen a lot of Black women die at a very young age, and a lot of Black women struggle in motherhood. And I made a conscious decision, and a lot of midwives gave me a look. I wanted to have a child young because to me it felt safer. And what Professor Arlene was saying was, this is a conscious decision being made by Black women who can see what is happening in their community and are saying actually it feels safer to have a child at a young age. But when you just shut down the whole debate and, you know, you blacklist the scholar who's saying this, and it's only now, like again in 2020, that the term weathering actually has come to light, with midwives looking at these statistics and looking at that relationship between racial discrimination and, you know, infant mortality and all of those things, and saying what is this relationship? It's researched a lot more in the US, but it's absolutely relevant to some of the conversations that we'll be having today.
Thank you. Wow. And thanks for sharing your personal experience there. That was, you know, really generous of you. Thank you. That something that really jumped out to me about all of the things that you talked about was the need to centre anti-discriminatory, anti-oppressive, anti-racist practice in our work. And those of us that are youth and community workers, right, that's in our national occupational standards. It's our bread and butter. It's supposed to be a really key facet of everything that we do with young people. And I think the thing that I heard most loudly in everything that you said is when we shut down those conversations, when we aren't transparent and open and brave enough to talk about these things that are really uncomfortable, then it would affect our ability to do that work well next to young people. So yeah, thank you. That was really generous of you to share that. I'm going to move from you sharing a bit of your own lived experience there to talking to asking you, Chloe, a bit about the Girl Guides survey that talks about lived experiences of young women. What are some of the things that you're hearing through your annual study from young women in the UK about their experiences?
Thanks so much, Abby. And yeah, thanks to the speakers already. Really interesting to hear from yourselves. Yeah, so we do a survey called the Girls' Attitude Survey. You might have heard of it, where we survey around 3,000 girls. They might be part of guiding, but we work with schools mainly, and it's actually in its 16th year this year. So we're able to really see how girls' views, attitudes, experiences have changed over time as well, which is really interesting to observe. And our research questions are co-created with girls. So we have girls that we call our advocates that we work with to sort of understand what's going on in their lives, so we can really make sure we're targeting the questions and unpacking some of their experiences further. And obviously, we're constantly thinking about what's happening in the external context. Over the last few years, there's been so much going on for girls. We survey girls from 7 to 21. Obviously, we have to be very careful about language and how we pull out some of those key experiences, but also being age appropriate and also being representative to make sure we pull out those intersectional experiences. And there's so much to talk about. The report, you'll see, that's just the half of it. There is so much more to delve into when we look at those intersectional experiences. So some of the topics, and it's really interesting, when we start the research every year, we try and look back at all the research that's happened before, and it's quite sad because a lot of the topics feel very similar, but there are definitely things in terms of how they're evolving as well. So some of the topics that we really hear from girls is just the absolute considerable appearance pressures they're having. We're now analysing our 16th research piece at the moment, and that for me consistently comes through as something really, really damaging. Struggling with their mental health and happiness in general, experiencing negative behaviours online, we'll talk probably more about that today, their general safety, being worried about the future. And that's stuff like being able to, afford food, be able to afford a house, etc. And these experiences obviously much more severe for those girls that are in more high deprivation areas, but also girls in general are feeling much more negative about the future. And across all of those topics, misogyny and sexism play a role across all of them when you explore them. We're also currently looking at sort of technology advancements, particularly generative AI, thinking about girls' appearances, filters. I mean, that's a massive thing that's very, very damaging to girls, and also promoting those idealistic Western beauty standards that you mentioned, Chantal. We actually had a session at Parliament a couple of weeks ago where the girls made MPs and everyone to just use these filters and adjust and to actually see what girls are having to deal with when they're trying to engage online positively. Online doesn't always have to be this sort of dangerous space like Chantal was mentioning. There's actually a lot of opportunity for girls to really embrace themselves. So just playing around with those filters, if you haven't, is quite a confronting experience. And the other thing we're trying to delve much more into is relationships with other girls and adults, and how that's impacting girls' experiences and attitudes in the UK. So those are some of the key topics. I think what's also interesting, Christina, you were talking about feminism and views of feminism, because all of those are like feminism topics and experience in different ways. But only sort of more than half of girls, 11 to 12, consider themselves a feminist. So, and that's been largely unchanged over time. And I think that's also with the language and how they identify. But I think it's important to not always to really explore those topics individually and not just call them feminist issues, because actually for a lot of girls, that's a really difficult topic for them to actually identify as a feminist. So I think it's really, really important to unpack the topics that I've mentioned. So in terms of, you know, some of the things we're seeing, and as mentioned, we see different stats depending on the lived experience, but an example of, you know, girls experiencing sexism and how they experience sexism and misogyny, we see a lot of, you know, particularly girls from high deprivation areas experiencing sexism much more at home, online, in the media, public spaces, politics, with partners and friends, much more than girls from less deprived areas. So it just kind of gives you a sense of the different experiences. And I guess in terms of just thinking about the topics I mentioned, it's really important to also, and what we've learned from the research is girls as young as 7 experience some of these topics and unfair treatment because they're a girl, being expected to behave differently, think differently, treated differently for how they look, the kind of sport and exercise they do, the things they like at school. And all of these things are just everyday experiences as girls as young as 7 are reporting that they're experiencing that. From a policy perspective, we've really been thinking about how we use some of that research in what we're talking about for the general election, and we released a manifesto a couple of weeks ago. One of the key things we've put like sort of front and center is, you know, more thorough relationship, sex, health education. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But in our research, we actually see a lot of girls tell us they are having positive relationship education at school. Nonetheless, those resources don't always talk about gender stereotypes. They're not actually talking about harmful attitudes against girls, calling out misogyny. So I think that's really interesting in terms of a policy perspective. And there's loads more I could talk about, but I'm conscious I've talked about a lot, but hopefully it gives you a flavour of some of the things we hear from girls. And yeah, do dive into the report for more information.
I was just going to say, they're always really worth the read, these reports. And if you get the opportunity to hear any of the young women who have taken part in the research, particularly the advocates, about their experiences of doing that, it's really, really, really worth connecting with them, because it's really powerful. Reading something is great about hearing about young women's experiences, but when you hear young women themselves talking about it, it's quite different, and it's quite impactful. I think it's really fascinating that you talked about this being sort of social conditioning from as early as you ask, and I guess many of us would say it starts even before that. It starts even at nursery, and the fact that young women are able to articulate that they're experiencing this and feeling that is really important. And I guess I would say, from our perspective, the role of youth work is to be where formal education isn't or can't be. And so as youth and community workers, we can talk about some of those tricky topics that maybe aren't being covered in formal education settings. And I think Jake made a really good point earlier. You know, there's 100,000 young people that aren't in formal education, that didn't return to school post-pandemic. Those young people will be having the same experiences in communities and in society, and we have a duty and a responsibility to support them in any way we can. So yeah, so it's about how we connect together to support there. Jake, Caroline, do you have anything that you'd like to add into this? So some of those more macro points, anything structural? Caroline.
Abby, I'd just jump in and really on Chloe's point, really re-emphasize the importance of youth participation and youth voice in designing some of the solutions and doing that meaningfully. And I can't wait to read that Girl Guides report. We have to open ourselves up to some of those really difficult and often uncomfortable conversations. And I mean, at the VRU, our model, our young person's advisory group really does that. So we try and engage young people intensively and meaningfully. We give them all the resources that they need to engage. So a laptop, we pay them a salary, we provide them with skills and upskilling opportunities, and we give them funds to lead some of their own social action projects within the communities on issues that matter to them. And actually, some of those points that Chloe was saying, we've seen young girls go out into their own communities and have those conversations. But we have to involve young people in all of this, and that often means some really challenging conversations.
It can be quite uncomfortable for the people in power to have to pass it over to young people, right?
Yeah.
But it definitely was echoed in what both Christina and Chantal were talking about there are some people that are always included in spaces and some people that are less included in spaces. And so unless we're prepared to give our power over and bring everybody in, then we'll only ever be telling one story, or we'll only ever be shaping services that address one particular person's experience, rather than understanding the difference of shaped individual experiences. Jake, did you want to come in on any of those points?
Yeah, I think we keep referencing, I think the thread through all of this is actually having those spaces, and I think that that's something that is often taken for granted. There are so many young people that are growing up without the opportunity to explore who they are in relation to their gender, what their definition of feminism is, what they, you know, even boys and young men, what their opinions are on gender-based violence and the prevalence and severity of the statistics and the disproportionality of the issue. And I think that, speaking of macro, I mean, it's already come up that we're living in a context where actually a lot of those spaces are being shut down. Those conversations, the opportunities to talk openly about these things are being stifled at a very sort of institutional and structural and societal level. So yeah, speaking of the relationship in sex education review, yeah, not being able to talk about sexual harassment until year 7, not being able to talk about puberty before year 3, not being able to talk about gender identity at all within schools, only really serves to stifle these really important conversations. If we're going to get to the next stage of this conversation and make meaningful change, we need to be able to do is have those conversations with young people regularly throughout their upbringing. It can't just be, you know, a lesson that's taught once a year in schools, or it can't just be one youth worker that works with a young person being the only person having those conversations with them. It needs to be that full wraparound, and finding as many opportunities to open up these spaces and hold them safely as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit on some really critical points there, Jay. And I think that kind of takes us nicely onto the next part of the conversation. I wanted to think about the people that are having those conversations, or the people that are doing that work and supporting young people, because I guess, so I'm a youth worker, but I'm also a teacher. I've worked in high school and I've also worked in lots of community settings. And I guess my experience of being in formal education is that often the people that are expected to do this work well with young people don't really have any training in it. They don't really necessarily understand how to have these quite difficult conversations with young people. It might be a science teacher, or in my school, actually, it was the RE teachers, surprise, surprise, who were given relationships and sex education as a topic. And so their approach to it wasn't necessarily as we would hope it would be in the context of the things that we've just talked about. It takes a certain skill set or a certain type of knowledge or training to be able to deal with some of these really difficult topics with young people in a way that's sensitive, constructive, compassionate, and values all of the different voices that might be in a room, because that's often quite tricky, right? So I wonder if we can start to have a bit of a think about, what do we think might be some of the skills, knowledge, and competencies that are needed to be able to do this work well? perhaps thinking about things like cultural sensitivities, lived experiences, how people might navigate their own biases in some of these spaces, and how things have really changed with some of this over the past few years. So Jake, I may as well pick straight back up with you on this one, actually. You obviously do work, or your organisation works in particularly in education settings, but also out of school. What's your view on this, like skills, knowledge, competency, people?
Yeah, so in being able to hold these spaces safely, it is a lifelong learning thing. There's always new research, there's always new terminology, there's always new discourse and perspectives that one needs to take into account. And if you're doing that alongside a full-time job as an RE teacher or a science teacher, it's an insurmountable task. So one of the things that we're pushing for as an organisation and lobbying for is that relationship education in informal education systems is seen as a specialist subject, where there is somebody whose job it is to be on top of ongoing and changing and developing discourse, and is therefore able to, you know, have those live conversations with young people at the times that they need it. I think some of the, so knowledge being one, it then needs to be opportunities for adults, all adults working with young people, to have regular CPD and learning about the core issues that we're talking about. People need to understand the foundations of gender-based violence. They need to understand the different definitions or perceptions of feminism. They need to understand the disparities and experiences between young people based on their race, their abilities, their sexuality. In order for people to talk to young people about that, they need to be able to understand and comprehend and explore it themselves. So a lot more opportunities for CPD and professional knowledge building. But then there's the translation of that to how do we work with children and young people? How do we take these really complex conversations that are ever changing and put it in a way that young people who may or may not have lived experience or have already established perceptions on, how do we do that? So Tender's approach is using the arts. So we think that the drama and arts-based working is a really useful way of having these conversations at an arm's length. You can talk through characters, you can talk through game-based discussions, etc., in a way that young people don't feel affronted to share their own experiences, don't feel like they're going to get it wrong, or they're going to be treated differently for saying something possibly controversial or ignorant. So I think that's Tender's approach, but I think at the core of it is being brave, trying new things, you know, having conversations in a way that young people want you to have those conversations, because talking to a young person in a standard classroom setting, where, you know, an hour ago you were teaching them biology, now you're teaching them sex and relationship education, it's not going to work, because it's a very live topic. It's not something you can teach, it's something that you need to explore. So yeah, I think bravery, I think shared responsibility as well, is that it can't just fall on the shoulders of people who are interested or passionate about the work. It needs to be statutory responsibility, I think, for anyone working with young people to have the guidance and support needed to be able to have these conversations with young people.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I think one of the things that I think was quite interesting in what you said was about the need for it to be continual development. We can't be, I mean, I trained a very long time ago. When I first used to deliver relationships education, I used to use EastEnders characters, you know, talking, as you were talking about using games. I'm not sure that would be particularly culturally relevant to most young people anymore. I don't know who watches EastEnders or who doesn't, but the point being, would I be skilled and competent and knowledgeable enough about what's going on in young people's lives today to do that work if I didn't have access. And I guess as well, there's something in that about sometimes it's quite complex and quite tricky. And so the need for practitioners to have support too, because they might end up carrying some quite heavy loads when they do this work with young people. So there's definitely something to think about that. And I also picked up on your point about guidance and statutory responsibility. We can't just leave this to chance. We need to be well informed, but also have some strict guardrails around that. I think that's really valuable. Caroline, can I bring you in here, because I know that you do some quite interesting work with young people as sort of leaders that you started to talk about. I didn't know if you wanted to kind of intersect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with Jake that really this should be, you know, within statutory provision. And I think that's why it's so, well, I think so disappointing last week when you saw that sort of policy shift away from RSHE over a certain age, when we know, well, actually by the age of 11, most of our young people have seen violent content and violent pornography online, for example. You've also then got in sort of the non-statutory education space, the sort of cuts to the youth sector, and in London alone, all of those sort of cuts to closures of youth centres and loss of that role. I think that the role sort of youth work in this space really, you know, can be transformational, and youth workers often are that sort of key consistent relationship and role model in a young person's life. And like Jake said, can find that hook with that young person. What really interests them? How do you engage them in a conversation? And I think youth workers are often very uniquely placed to have that relationship. So in terms of the VRU's role, yes, we have our young people's action group who are part of our organisation. We upskill them, we provide them with the skills they need to lead their own social action projects within their communities. And certainly I can provide a little bit more resources sort of in the chat on how we do that. In terms of youth work in particular, I'd also want to plug our sort of Rise Up youth worker leadership programme for any London practitioners on the call, which is really doing what I was sort of saying about staying agile to the issues of the time. So it's delivered through London Youth. It covers many of those topics that Jake was referring to about being intersectional and gender informed and understanding of the different issues that young people are facing online, for example. And that's open to applications now. So I definitely plug that as well, Abby. And I can pop some of the details of that in the chat.
Yeah, please do. People, one of the things that we often get as feedback from these sessions is that people really want the opportunity to find out where things are great and what they can learn from and to connect. So that will be really, really helpful. Chantal, can I bring you in here if that's okay? Because one of the things that I think was really important about what you were saying was about you were talking about sort of colorism and proximity and the impact of sort of Western ideals of beauty on young Black women. And I wonder, when we're talking about sort of relationships and proximity, are there any additional things that we need to think about people and work specifically for young Black women in this space?
I think one of the things that Jake was saying was quite important around how these conversations show up and who should be trained and when. I mean, anyone working with young people, for instance, I have a personal tutor cohort, and as we know, universities have many different departments of various supports available for students, but students will always come to the person that they feel they have a relationship with and the person they can trust, which means just by default, we need to be upskilled on everything that might come through the door, because if someone comes to me, I have to, even if I need to signpost onto a service, I have to be able to deal with whatever they present me with and support them appropriately in that moment, which means that you need to stay on top of emerging conversations. And for me, this brings me back to social media discourse and how that feeds in to themes like relationships, sexual exploitation, interpersonal violence, and all of those things. There's two key issues that are being massively debated in Black communities at the moment, and these can sometimes be absolute gems. And, you know, as with many communities in bringing about really hard-hitting themes, there's obviously everything that is happening with P. Diddy, which has brought gender violence to the table like, you know, nothing else at the moment. This conversation about, okay, what is happening here, why wouldn't she bleed, and how does race play into that? But also an even bigger conversation, and I'm actually going to London in a few hours, not to debate that, but the debate after mine is about this, is Kendrick Lamar versus Drake. Because while everyone's laughing about this you know, so-called beef, there's really big accusations of people having relationships with young girls, of wife beating, and it's spoken about in such a casual manner that anyone working with children and young people, especially young Black people, boys, girls, you know, everyone within the community has a duty to say, this is actually really serious, some of the things that are being discussed in these diss tracks. Let's actually, and I know fantastic youth workers in Merseyside who will literally, because that's all young people are talking about at the moment. And I always listen to my 17-year-old, you know, young mixed race boy, because he says, Mum, have you heard about this? And I'm like, well, you know what, let me hear about this. And then we sit down and I go, okay, you know, tracks aside, what do you think about what he's saying about being with a young girl? What do you think? And that is a real good opener for a really important conversation about relationships and age and consent and all of those things. So sometimes you have to look for really sort of casual inroads and what is circulating on social media to have these big conversations and to have them in a really casual way, because there is this perception, and this is a huge duty on policing too, because the relationship with policing has broken down so much with the Black community in relation to the harms and the regular videos circulating of young Black men being shot for doing absolutely nothing. That then closes the door quite often for a lot of young Black girls to ever, because to them it will seem the phone in the police is a death sentence, and I don't want someone to die, I just want this to stop. So who are we then working with? What services do we work with? Who supports young Black girls? And how do we tackle that conversation of it's actually not on you to think about the consequence of phoning the police, but the work is being done in relation to how the police respond to our community as victims of crime and as victims of domestic abuse? Because which way you turn in terms of statistics, Black women and women of colour in general are massively less likely to involve the police. And when they do involve the police, it's usually a life or death situation, because that is sort of the threshold. And so there's a lot of big conversations to be had, but a lot of those conversations do have to happen within communities. And when we consider, you know, specialist services that we might signpost to, for instance, counselling, it's only recently in spaces like counselling that we've actually gone, well, a lot of the issues that young people, young women, Black people might be dealing with are specifically related to their identity as a Black person. So how are people upskilled in responding to that? Because quite often that process can be gaslighting for people in having to explain racism and then explain how racism's impacting you and explain that huge factor of race and how it impacts your relationships and all of those things. So I absolutely, you know, believe that we need to have those skills, but I also think when we're looking at communities of colour specifically, we need to look at who are young Black women and girls going to go to, because it might not always be the service that has all of those skills. It might be the youth worker down the road. It might be the only Black person in this building, the only Black member of staff. And that's something that happens for me a lot. People know I'm the only Black member of staff, so they will just walk through my door, and that's absolutely fine. And how do we upskill those people who are the people who young people are going to go to when they have any issues or anything they need support with?
Yeah, I mean, some hugely relevant and seriously important points that you made there. And I think a couple of things that I just want to re-highlight for the people who are listening is that the point about music is a really, really great one, because what you're talking about is hanging conversations on something that's completely culturally relevant to young people today. I've got a 12-year-old and a 20-year-old, right? So, you know, if I want to speak to my 12-year-old, it's music or FIFA, right? So as long as I can make it related to football, we can have a conversation about it. And youth workers are really good at that, really, really good at just being in tune with what experiences people are having and what's important to them, and then using that to unpick some quite tricky topics in a safe way. I think I just want to highlight as well the point that you made about cultural sensitivity and understanding that not all experiences are the same, but also not all responses are the same, and that there might be additional barriers and fear for people based on their culture, for example, being a young Black woman, and their lived experience of structures in society that makes talking about some of this stuff feel quite dangerous and quite risky. I'm just going to flag 2 organisations that are doing some really good work in this space because I think it's useful. So there's they're both London based, an organisation called Power the Fight that works in London and that do some brilliant work, therapeutic interventions for peace, and it's everything that they do is related in cultural sensitivity and really understanding and connecting with the communities that you're working in. Takes a very strong place-based approach. And also Milk and Honeybees, which is an organisation that works with young women in Lambeth, and they've got a fascinating report actually that I can share post this event with the other resources, and their report talks specifically about adultification, so the way that Black young women experience service intervention and support, but their report is research from the voices of young women. So it's not adults telling their story, it's young women being able to be supported to talk about what their experiences are and who they talk to and why they access that help. So I really urge you to have a look at both of those organisations. They're really useful and really helpful, really experienced. Definitely worth connecting with if you're interested in learning a bit more about how to upskill yourself in this particular area. We did start to talk a little bit here about spaces and places. You know, where are young people happening? Where are we talking about the distracts, you know, detached work in schools, in classrooms? I also want us to start thinking now about, well, what do we need to know about the environment that we might need to create to do this work? And I really want us to think about online as well as offline, because we know that young people are operating increasingly in digital environments. I said earlier on, a 12-year-old at home constantly have to listen to group phone calls while they're on PlayStation talking to one lot of people and in a WhatsApp group phone call for another. They can be next to each other in a room, right? But they're still both on social media, our young people. So understanding what's happening in the online world is really important. We've seen this a lot most recently with talk about people like Andrew Tate and the impact of people like him and his online influence and how that's translating to the experiences of young women. So I think it's worth us just giving a little bit of time to think about that. Christina, can I come to you a little bit about this? Because I know that you've done some sort of interesting thinking about sort of online spaces and some of the harms that happen there.
Thank you. Yes, so I've done research specifically with feminist activists who are active online. At the time, they were mainly active on Instagram. It might well be TikTok by now. It always changes. As a researcher, you can't keep up with that. But that was the environment. And then, of course, as part of teaching, you know, on gender and the media, I've also done readings on, you know, young people's experiences of being online, especially young women's experiences of being online. And I think 2 things I'd like to highlight. So the one thing that's come up really strongly in my research and colleagues' research, both in relation to like feminist activists who are just, you know, one subgroup as it were, but also young people in general, is this idea to feel judged. Social media is something that is very public in many ways, as we all know, but there's this real sense of this real fear of getting it wrong and what might happen that affects young women, and that, of course, is then reflected in different ways through race and class. So to give you one example in relation to class in particular, and this is in relation to feminist activism online, but I could imagine it matters in other spheres too, is this idea that you kind of have to have some knowledge of what's going on in order to be able to take part in these debates, which requires access to these resources. knowledge of abbreviations and so on, knowing how to write well to a certain extent, to design your contributions in a certain way. And a lot of these activities are classed. So, you know, not everybody has access to these devices. If they do have access, not everybody has the know-how of how to write content that is appealing, how to follow these debates, the kind of terminology that needs to be used, and so on. So that's worth keeping in mind, because I think we quickly say, oh, these platforms are free of charge, everybody can join them, there are no barriers. But there are some barriers in terms of the ability to contribute and to be heard and to feel heard, and to do so in a way that is not so anxiety producing. And that links to the second aspect, that there were real differences in the participants, and there felt real difference in how confident they were in sharing content. This was in relation to working class women in particular, Black women in particular, and this fear of getting it wrong. And yes, these environments can be quite punitive, as we know, including in, you know, these spaces, feminist spaces, that where they really also try to support each other. And there was a lot of that as well. And I think it's important to bear this in mind. Social media is not all bad and evil, as we know. Otherwise, why would so many people be on it? Why would we, you know, we wouldn't spend so much time on it if we didn't get something out of it. But I think it can have these two sides, right? That we long for spaces of support and community and belonging, and then we get disappointed, and then it can change quite quickly. And these fears are really there, and there aren't just fears, they're also real experiences, and they have an effect on people. And I think what's so tricky, and I really don't have the answer to that, is how do we deal with that, right? We can tell young people, you know, about all these things. They will know that anyways, long before we tell them that, right? But just simple awareness it's not like a vaccination where you get a jab and then it's all fine, right? You know, social media can be bad for you, and therefore be careful, and therefore it won't affect me. I mean, it doesn't work that way. And yeah, I don't know how to take this forward. You are the experts in the room in that sense. I can only do the research and find things and then communicate this. But yeah, so these were some of the issues that I've come across and that others have come across in research. So that's not really only my findings at all.
Thank you. I think the really interesting point that you talked about there was about young people perhaps being fearful to engage. So there's something about young people feeling like they've got all of the information and they're empowered to be able to assert themselves, or to challenge, or to kind of stand up to sometimes some of those tricky things that they're experiencing online. Against the backdrop, we're also know lots of young people experience digital poverty, so they might not even have access to online environments apart from in certain specific contexts. So there's those two things kind of sitting alongside each other, as well as you said, noticing that actually there's also a lot of solidarity online, and people can find people to connect to, and they can find support, and it can be a really positive way to address some of this discrimination and to feel like you've got some support and some people behind you. So it's how we balance those things as workers, I think, and how we progress from that. Chloe, what kind of things have you heard, so to contribute to that? What things have your young people been talking about? I'd like to, if you can share with us whether have they come up with any solutions, like what are young women's ideas about how we address some of this stuff?
Thanks so much, Abby. I think I'll start by just talking about the extent of the sort of challenges online. Like, it is an area we've seen over time really increase in terms of girls experiencing threatening or upsetting behaviour online. So it was 65% in 2018. In 5 years, we've jumped to 81%. I think just overall kind of just lands the extent of what girls are experiencing online and how it translates into their lives. Girls are telling us mostly it's making them feel angry, it's making them feel less safe, and it's making them feel less confident. And that confident piece is obviously influences girls' abilities to thrive and, you know, have a great time and go about their lives as they should. Really interesting about the Christina point on the fear of getting it wrong. We hear the exact same from girls. Only half of girls feel like they're actually able to speak about their views, and again online, which again is just emphasizing that they're so interacting with that space, but they feel safe and they're unsafe, and they're not able to actually talk about the things that matter to them. We also see those challenges, varying for different identities. So particularly LGBTQ+ girls, neurodiverse girls, disabled girls, girls of colour, experiencing more likely to experiencing harmful content online, which sort of talks, again about the challenges. Girls are getting people not, they don't know, contact them, seeing rude images, getting sent sexual images, cyberbullying, just emphasizing the extent of the challenges we have. In terms of support, there's so much. Girls tell us they want more, tech companies to put more protections in and listen. That debate is super complex, and I think we'll be a long way off it, unfortunately, which is really, really sad. But some of the things girls tell us that I think we can do and apply in various elements of our work is, letting them know how to protect their privacy, like how to do that in an easy way. So girls want to, that would make them feel safer. Their concerns being taken seriously, even if it's a conversation. We're seeing a lot more of these things happening in our sort of safeguarding issues at Girl Guiding, and those reports coming in. So really, taking them seriously, supporting them how to report the content, albeit we know it's not always responded to timely or even responded to. But for them, that would make them feel safe. And then I also think the championing girls' voices online is a big one, particularly when we think about them feeling like they can't talk about what they want to talk about. One of the things we've just introduced at Girl Guiding is content creators, where we're actually getting girls leading our content and like taking the phones and like leading the way. And although there's so much protections and support we need to provide them, we train them up, etc. But it's also championing, trying to get girls feeling like they can talk about what they want to online. So that's really, really key. There's also some resources we actually have as well, in terms of our programme, in terms of what we do with girls. And it's to help them with lessen the impact of online harms. Unfortunately, that's where we have to kind of focus our efforts. We have something called the Media Critic, where we help them sort of develop their media literacy, feeling good skills builder, which is all about them feeling confident, building their self-esteem and resilience, and also Breaking Free, which is all about thinking about gender stereotypes and how they can like think about that and develop assertiveness in the media and cultural awareness. So those are sort of resources we have, which are available as well, that you can use and see if if it works in your context or with the girls that you're working with. But those are some of the things that girls tell us they can do, and then how we apply it in our programme as well, and how we work at Girl Guiding.
Lovely. I really like the idea about young women being able to own content creation as well. I'm pretty confident that there's quite a lot of work going on in the digital youth work space at the moment. So I have no doubt you'll be getting some emails about that post this. I'm going to come to Chantal if I can, and then I'm going to come to Caroline. So Chantal, you mentioned in your intro that sometimes social media can be really, really positive in terms of disrupting experiences of like misogyny and harm for young Black women. I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, social media, again, while recognising the absolute toxicity and the fact that, especially Black women and girls are significantly more likely to be targeted. And also, mentioning people like Eni Aluko, who were relentlessly targeted because she was a punter by people like Joey Barton, and her actually saying, well, actually, no, one of the trolls who was unmasked actually saying she was the easier target, which is often the way, because Black women are seen as easier targets because there's less people defending them. Equally, the opposite of that is the online social media, Black Twitter, Instagram, TikTok have really been rallying spaces. and spaces that especially young people can go and be seen and see people who look like them or represent them. And essentially it is that case of, you know, finding your tribe, finding your page, finding your interest, and hopefully setting the algorithms so that you see more of those things online. Without social media, I don't think we would have made the headway that we made in 2020 with Black Lives Matter. The beginning of that movement, we still had the media, you know, massively reinforcing negative stereotypes of Black people. Even the coverage of the protests was completely biased and focusing in on the tiniest acts of violence that were like, I think 1% was the violence rate at protests, which had hundreds of thousands of people on the street, and the media were focusing on that. But social media was just this tool that we were able to use to highlight Black lived experiences and highlight that intersectionalities, and to actually have a space for people to have that voice and to say, this is me, this is what being a Black young girl, this is what being a Black young person who is LGBTQ+, this is what being a Black person with disabilities is about. And that's something that we've had like never before. And it also created a space where it was almost impossible for people to dispute our experiences of, you know, whether it be misogynoir, colorism. We were able to visually show, this is what happens when you search this on Google, this is what happens when you search appropriate hairstyles. You could put things next to each other. But equally, I think, especially for someone, so the area that I live in and the area that I represent as a councillor, it's slightly increased now, but when I was growing up, it was less than 1% of families were Black. Like, we knew every Black person in the area because there were so few of us. And when you grow up, and a lot of the people we connected with in the Northwest in terms of Black civil rights groups and people within the movement, were people who very rarely were in a room of people who looked like them or in a room of people who were like them. They were more used to being in rooms where they were the only one, or buildings where they were the only one. And that can be, you know, that can really do something to your sense of identity. And I think having these digital spaces is so empowering and so affirming, and can bring you together in digital spaces. And that was something that so many of our younger members and the younger people who were part of our movement absolutely loved, especially young people who were in rural areas, who were massively far away from the movement, like physically, you know, London, where a lot of the actions were happening. They loved the fact that we had digital spaces too, and they could digitally connect with people who had similar lived experiences. So we're the only Black people, you know, I live in the village and things like that. It's really, really difficult. So they can be affirming spaces. There's, you know, there's hashtags like Black Girl Magic. There's all those hashtags, dark skin Black girls. There's loads of algorithms where you can see just so much positive reinforcement for women with dark skin. Natural hair, there's loads of natural hair hashtags, and that there's something for everyone. But the idea is that even if you can't see people around you who look like you or wear the hair like you can connect with people online who do that. And there's so many influencers, and luckily I do think a lot of that online movement and that online platforming of people who were darker skinned and who didn't conform to those beauty standards, that actually filtered in. And now we can actually see, you know, if I go to the shop, you don't always just see white models. I read magazines, and I've noticed now how magazines change. We don't just look at, and you know, these are areas where young people still read. We don't just look at skincare routines for Western skin. We look at Black skincare routines too, because that information is, you know, it's completely the opposite. Quite often, Western skincare routines are not on having oily skin, but our skin needs to be moisturised all of the time and actually needs extra moisture, especially in winter. Equally, our hair needs extra moisture. So that understanding that your target audience is diverse, as you know, fashion brands and beauty magazines, so ensure that the needs of your target audience are included, and ensure that you're reaching a wide spectrum of women, and you're not making them feel completely marginalised. One of the tangible improvements that we saw off the back of the latest civil rights movement, and this is something I used to get mad about this all of the time, in winter when it got to Christmas time, a lot of shops, especially in less diverse areas, a lot of beauty shops would take Black products off the shelves and would take hair products and skin products off the shelves to make way for Christmas products, because that was a smaller, you know, cohort of customers. And the movement has actually meant that now the shelves of Black products are bigger, and they don't move when it gets to November through to January. They stay there all year round. And I think that's so powerful. I went to a conference, I think last week, and it was specifically exploring living while Black in university and what it means for people who live in areas like London to come to an area like Liverpool, and how we ensure that young people have directories for things like hair care and skincare, and especially young girls have those social connections with people who they might connect with and might have that cultural connection with, and how we have a duty to ensure that people are sort of having that cultural connection as well as social connections and all of those things, because that's just as important, and that relationship building and all of those things that impact people's sense of identity, that's just as important as all of the other stuff that we do. So it's been 4 years, we're almost 4 years since the BLM movement took off, and those conversations are still happening. And while we're not in a perfect place, we are still seeing daily action to ensure that it's not moving off the agenda, and it's not we're not just overlooking those needs, because they're very real needs, especially for young Black girls.
Absolutely, and there's some hugely interesting points that you made within that. I was particularly interested in there's something about you talked about like representation, and it matters, and being able to see and feel and connect to people that have a shared experience to you, look like you. And in youth work, we have a duty to try and do that through the people that we bring into our workforce and how we bring people together. But it was great to hear how you were talking about how where that's not possible, so rural young people, isolated young people, people with disabilities, for example, how you can use social media as a positive tool in that space. And I guess understanding some of the stuff about like the algorithms and things that can be used would be really helpful for people. So things like hashtags and things that can be shared. I wonder as well whether there was something there about what you said about competency and understanding the different needs of different groups of young women for workers, and being able to really connect into that, which I think kind of takes us into sort of this last section. We've only got a few minutes left, which is about practice and what are the things that we can really do, and what are some of our work experiences that are particularly valuable. So I'd like to come to Caroline first, because we can jump from the back of the conversation about digital to talk about the social switch, and then I'm going to come to you after that, Jake, if that's okay. So Caroline, can you tell us a little bit about the social switch?
I can. So well, actually, social switch was born out of so many of the issues that have been raised here today, and really that sort of pace of change, Abby, and the trusted adults, professionals, teachers, parents in young people's lives just feeling really ill-equipped to respond. I mean, I just think about how different my experience growing up online is to young people now, and like we hearing a lot about sort of male podcasters perpetrating really sort of misogynistic content, which is badged in a really self-help way. So young people are really struggling to cut through sort of what is factual and what's not. Our young people, one of our young women actually came with me and talked to the mayor about having her images taken from her Instagram and then made into nudes. Just that the sort of proliferation of different types of violence and harm now is just changing so rapidly. So social switch was really about equipping the trusted professionals in young people's lives to keep up with that pace of change. And it's a collaboration between Red Thread and Catch 22. So again, I can share the link in terms of how professionals on the call can access some of that. But then the other part of social switch is about changing the narrative, which we've again talked a fair bit about, and highlighting the significant benefits actually to young people in terms of their social lives, identity and education. And social switch therefore offers a skills and employability program to our young people. It's open to young Londoners, and it's sort of a very high quality mentoring offer, guidance into sort of digital careers, how to manage social media, and really, guiding young people into sort of work placements. So again, I'd be happy to share a link to that opportunity too.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. That will be really helpful thinking about some of the things that Chantal particularly was talking about. We can connect some of those digital tools together to help equip a workforce. Jake, can I just ask you to tell us a little bit about your reset model? Because I know lots of us, we don't work in silo, right? Those of us that are working with young women and with young people, we are always part of a community. And so I think it'll be really interesting to finish with a bit of an understanding about reset, actually.
Yeah, sure. I'll be as brief as I can. Reset is our whole setting approach at Tender, and I think it's something that we're very proud of, because it's quite a pioneering approach, I think, in education. What we know that we can teach relationship education, we can teach about everything that we've talked about today in a conventional setting, and then that young person goes home, and if those messages aren't being reinforced at home, that it becomes another lesson that's likely to be forgotten. So Reset is a year-long accreditation program for settings that enables them to really think about how they can get the entire community involved in A, promoting healthy relationships, but B, preventing violence against women and girls. So it involves a number of delivered initiatives from Tender, so working with staff, interventions with young people, a campaign program where young people were given some money to create a creative campaign that goes to the wider community with a key message around preventing abuse or healthy friendships and relationships in primary schools, and also parent and carer workshops as well. So engaging the community outside of school in how to have conversations with their young people about some of the topics that we've talked about. As I say, it's a year-long program, and each setting gets a mentor, which is a member of staff that works with them across that period of time to support them through the award. They have to provide evidence to demonstrate that not only are they, taking what we're offering, but they're also reflecting on their practice, looking at their policies, looking at their the contact time that they're putting through their curriculum maps, etc. And I saw there was a question in the chat about the support possibly being offered by any of us to disabled young people, and that's a significant part of this program as well. We have an arm of the program which is specifically working with specialist schools and out of school settings, because of course we need to acknowledge the fact that disabled women particularly are twice as likely to experience domestic abuse in their lives. So it's vitally important that we're not letting those young people slip through the gaps, that we're entering those settings, providing them those settings with the opportunity to reflect and do better when it comes to offering relationship education. Yeah, so it's a massive program. We're working with the violence reduction unit in London to deliver that to 70 schools in London, but it's also taking place across the country. So if there's anyone that's interested in that program, send us a line.
I'm pretty confident there will be, Jake. So you might need to put some filters on your inbox. Brace yourself. Yeah. I'm really sorry to say that we've actually reached the end of our time. Just to kind of summarize some of the key things that we've heard come out from this, there is a need for us to really understand and contextualize the diversity of experiences of young women in this space, and understand the unique experiences that young women have in relation to misogyny and some of the gender the expectations of young women based on their gender. There's a need for us to think creatively and to ensure that we are working with young women to understand how we can begin to address some of these things and understand how they would like to co-create solutions with us. There's a sense of us to need to understand the difference of experiences from young people in the online space and in the real world, but also how we can bring those two things together in order to create both solidarity, but also different systems for support and collaboration and connectivity. And there's definitely a sense about just understanding that it's important to always ask the right questions, but also to focus on making sure that you're keeping up to date with what's happening for young people more generally, and also for young women in this space. We could talk about this for days. I've got so many questions here that I was like, oh, and I wanted to talk about this thing, and I've literally written pages and pages of notes. But we can't, I'm afraid. But what we will do is we'll follow up with the details, any research, any comments, websites, etc. that the panelists have mentioned. We'll circulate those to you. If you have any other ideas for anything you specifically wanted to ask but didn't get the chance, send them in to us and we can forward them on. We'll be sharing a feedback form with you. Please do give us some feedback, because it enables us to refine these sessions and make them even better. And do keep an eye out for the next in the series. This was webinar 2 of 4, focusing on sort of gender and misogyny. So watch this space. The next one will be coming soon. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And we're really grateful to you. And hopefully you don't get too many people flooding your inboxes as a result of this. So thank you very much, everybody. Please take care. Survey links just gone into the chat, so click on it before you move on. And yeah, I hope you have a lovely rest of the day.